Hello, my name is Kim Davenport and I serve as Communications Manager for Tacoma Historical Society. But I'm coming to you today in a more personal capacity as a longtime Tacoma resident, Tacoma historian, and someone with a deep family history in this city. One that is far deeper than I initially knew before getting into more research of it. I will start with an admission, which is that I grew up in Seattle. But I grew up with a father who was a vivid storyteller about his childhood in Tacoma. And I also frequently visited my grandmother here. And through those connections, had a vague sense of the fact that there was a Tacoma connection to my family tree. But like many of us, my knowledge of my ancestry was filled with half-truths and lost stories, and it took some time to uncover all of the reality of those stories. So since choosing to make Tacoma home about 25 years ago now, I've really had the chance to delve into those stories, and I have a much greater appreciation for the depth of my roots here. So as you know, in 2023, we are celebrating the sesquicentennial, or 150th anniversary, of the decision to name Tacoma as the terminus of the Northern Pacific Railroad. And I've been thinking a lot about that this year, and have come to the realization that without that decision, not only, of course, would Tacoma not be what it is today, that decision shaped this city in so many ways, but I would not be here. And I don't simply mean that in the sense that I would not be in Tacoma giving this talk. I mean that I would not exist. Without the draw of Tacoma as that terminus at the end of the Northern Pacific, my ancestors would not have come here. My different families that came together to eventually lead to my grandparents all meeting here in Tacoma, my DNA would not have been created in the way that it was. So it is really a pleasure for me to be able to share some of these stories with you about those ancestors of mine who, some of whom I knew, many of whom I did not, and whose stories I've been uncovering over the past several years. So I'd like to begin with this map of the Northern Pacific Railroad route, which comes from 1883. And it shows many stops along the east to west route of the railroad. And I also chose it, though, because it shows the connection to San Francisco, which was largely by boat. And that brings me to the story of the first of my ancestors to arrive in Tacoma. This is HIRAM Pardo Tuttle. He was born in 1844 in Iowa, and he was 7 years old when his family decided to come west in covered wagons. The family eventually settled in Watsonville, California, and his father purchased a 200-acre farm and became a successful farmer. In 1860, when HIRAM was just 16, he entered college at the University of the Pacific in Santa Clara. And when he graduated, he promptly went on to medical school at Toland Medical College, which is the oldest medical school in California and eventually became part of the University of California system. He received his Doctor of Medicine degree in 1868, earning the gold medal for his class, and soon opened a private practice in Monterey, California. He maintained that practice until 1889 and interestingly served as the local doctor for the Southern Pacific Railroad. So my understanding of that is that when patients would come through, there needed to be a doctor in different towns that the railroad passed through, and he served in that role while he was practicing in Monterey. In these early years of his career, he married Kara Johnson, whose family was also from Iowa, and the couple had 6 children between 1867 and 1884. He was disappointed with the pace of development in Monterey, California, and he was eager to find new challenges and new opportunities, and that is what brought him to Tacoma. He traveled here alone. I have no physical record of his specific trip, but I do know that he came here alone, leaving his family behind in California until he could get settled in Tacoma. And my assumption of the route of his trip is that he would have made the rather short trip from Monterey to San Francisco, boarded a ship there to the mouth of the Columbia, and then taken the train the rest of the way to Tacoma. So in the 1889 Tacoma City Directory, HIRAM appears as being a doctor in private practice with an office on Pacific Avenue, and he was living at 420 South 9th Street. In 1890, he was appointed by the city council to be the health officer for the city of Tacoma. This is in the age before the Tacoma-Pierce County Health Department. And by later that year, so just within a year of living here, he had had a house built on North I Street, 1108 North I Street, and had brought his family up to live in that home. It's disappointing that I haven't been able to find any photographs of what sounds from newspaper descriptions to be a very elegant and opulent home, but it was torn down a long time ago. It is now the block of North I Street that is filled with a parking lot for St. Patrick's Church. So if you've driven past there near Lowell School, that's where that house stood. So it appears from everything I've found that Dr. Tuttle was a respected and successful doctor. He maintained his position with the city and also served in a leadership role with the Pierce County Medical Society and State Medical Society. But it's also clear that the ambition that brought him to Tacoma in the first place would eventually catch up with him, and he would want to try something new. After the economic crash of 1893, which hit Tacoma very hard, and with Klondike fever at its height, the doctor began experimenting with chemicals for making explosives. He invented an explosive called thorite, which he claimed was powerful enough to break up the frozen ground in Alaska for gold miners. But rather than having potential for that market, it quickly drew the attention of the American military. And by 1899, his explosives had passed official U.S. military tests, proving that they were both safe and also more powerful than existing explosives in use by the military. So a congressional appropriations bill drafted in 1899 included a line item to purchase the exclusive use and production of thorite by the U.S. military in exchange for a $50,000 payment to Dr. Tuttle, which would be about the equivalent of $2 million today. Unfortunately for Dr. Tuttle, there appears to have been a competing explosive invented by someone else on the East Coast, which was the favorite of some high up in the military. And mysteriously, the line item for thorite was removed from that congressional appropriations bill. So Dr. Tuttle decided to make the train trip back to Washington, D.C. to testify before Congress. That happened in 1901. He arrived back in Tacoma several weeks later on October 9th, 1901, walked from the train station downtown to his home at 11th and North I, sat down at the kitchen table, said hello to his wife, and dropped dead of a massive heart attack. Unfortunately, this meant that he was unable to continue fighting for that $50,000 appropriation to sell his invention to the U.S. government. Our Senator Cushman, fought for that and tried to get that line item put back into future congressional bills to benefit HIRAM's widow and children, but unfortunately that never happened. So perhaps because of this kind of sad ending to his life, this is a story that I had to uncover through my research. This was not a story I knew from my grandparents who were descendants of HIRAM. It seems to have been completely lost. But it did, however, set our family roots on that particular side of the family in Tacoma. Let's now jump forward a few decades to the arrival of all the other branches of my family tree. So we're going to come now to the 1920s. And I'm sharing a newer map, I should say, of the Northern Pacific Railway. There are several such maps from the early 1900s, but I chose to share this particular one because it gives a glimpse of all the different places that my other ancestors would have traveled from when they came to Tacoma. So those three different states were Kansas, Wisconsin, and South Dakota. Wisconsin and South Dakota both would have been on the Northern Pacific Railway line. My ancestors would not have had to travel very far to get to those stops. My ancestors from Kansas had a few different options, as I'm seeing from this map, but there were other offshoots of other railways that would have connected with the Northern Pacific from Kansas. As I'm sure is true for many families, maybe some people watching this right now, I don't actually have train tickets. Those were not saved or kept as important artifacts by my ancestors. But what I do have are stories from those ancestors to confirm Oh, yes, that train journey was very dramatic. And oh, yes, I remember arriving in Tacoma and thinking, wow, this big city is so much more dramatic than anything I've seen before. So let's meet some of these other relatives. Harry Davenport was born into a large family in Kansas in 1893. He is pictured in both of the pictures here. At right is Harry as a very young boy with his parents, and then at left is a little bit later picture. He's the young man kind of dead center in that picture. His father was one of the first settlers of the town of Rose Creek, which is in an area of Kansas that was settled quite heavily by European immigrants right after the Civil War. Harry was initially drawn to the ministry, and while pursuing that calling, he moved back and forth between Kansas and Nebraska, where he married his wife, Edna. One of the enduring mysteries of Harry's story, which I have not uncovered or been able to explain, is why he chose in the 1920s to leave the ministry behind and bring his family to Tacoma. I know that it happened, but I have no idea exactly why he did that. Did he have a crisis of faith? Did he desire to make more money to support his young family? Was there some sort of scandal that forced him to leave? I really don't know. And that's the type of story that can be really hard to uncover. But those guesses aside, let's move on with their story. In 1923, Harry, his wife Edna, and their two children, Harmon, who was 7, and Amber, who was 4, arrived in Tacoma and rented a house in South Tacoma on South Ferdinand. Their third child, Don, was born here in 1924. And for his new profession after leaving the ministry, Harry chose to sell insurance. And this is what he would do for the rest of his career. He bought and sold several properties in the coming decades, the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And it seems to me, from what I'm able to uncover from the records, that essentially they were flipping houses, as we would call it now. They were living in the houses as they worked on them. I do know from family stories that he was quite the craftsman, and then they would move on to a new address. So looking through the city directories at this family, there's quite the array of different addresses in the 1920s and 30s especially. So I never met my grandfather Harmon, and uncovering more about his life story was one of my main motivations for first getting into local history research. When I discovered that he was an alum of Lincoln High School, which I look out and see out my window every morning in my house, and to find that one of the houses that family lived in was literally 3 or 4 doors down from my house that I chose when moving back to Tacoma, was really a profound moment in my family history research story. So one last thing about Harry before I move on to our next family. This is a story that I believe to be true because I've heard it from multiple family members. However, I haven't been able to find artifacts to verify it yet, so this is ongoing research for me. But as the story goes, Harry owned at least one and maybe more homes that were in the path of Interstate 5 when the freeway was being built through the Seattle-Tacoma area. As we know, entire neighborhoods were wiped out by the development of I-5. And some people fought the development more than others. Some families eagerly took a payment from the government and left right away as soon as that was offered to them. Others were a little bit more stubborn. Apparently, Harry held out as long as he could. And I don't know whether that was on principle, whether he was anti-highway, or whether he was just trying to get a bigger check from the government. But I'm still hunting for what has been described to me by multiple family members as a front page photo on the newspaper where he was sitting on the porch of one of his houses in nothing but his long underwear, looking very stern as he protested the government's claims of eminent domain to take his house from him. So the search continues. So the first 2 families I've shared with you, the story of HIRAM TUTTLE and his descendants who stayed in Tacoma, and then the Davenports, these were stories of families that had been in the United States for many generations. They had long called themselves Americans, and they came to Tacoma by choice. It wasn't a necessity. It was an option and an opportunity. But I'd like to move on to a family that has a much different story, and that brings us to the Robertsons. Jens Corey was born in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1855 and came alone to the United States in 1876 as a young man, changing his name when he arrived here to James Robertson. So that's the origin of the Robertson name for this family. Martha Vick was born in rural northern Germany in 1869 and came with her parents and siblings to the United States in 1883. So James and Martha met and married in Wisconsin in 1886 and settled and developed a small farm in the tiny community of Ceylon, Wisconsin. So you can see in these pictures, James is at the far right of the picture that is at the far right on this slide, and Martha is in the middle, standing next to him. By the time of the 1910 census, both James and Martha had become U.S. citizens. They are listed as English speakers. They owned their farm, and they had welcomed 5 children into their family. Their youngest, my grandfather Edna, was born in 1911. She is the little girl in the picture at right, and she is the older girl in the second picture from the right, holding her younger brother. So that was 1911. Sadly, in 1916, Martha would pass away at the age of just 46. And this is where the stories get a little murkier from what I was told by my grandmother. James was either heartbroken or he abandoned his family. It depends on which family story you listen to, but by all accounts, he moved away to Canada, leaving the care of the younger children with his now adult older children. I haven't been able to confirm anywhere that he lived in the 1910s or early 1920s, so I really haven't been able to confirm the details of that story, in large part because he seems to have gone back and forth between the Robertson name and his original Danish name of Corey. So adult children in their 20s having to figure out what to do with themselves, clearly deciding not to continue managing their farm in Wisconsin. So Minnie was the first to ride the Northern Pacific from Wisconsin to Tacoma in 1916 when she was 22, and she pursued a career as a teacher here. Minnie's older sister Dora, who was 29, arrived in 1918 with young Edna, my grandmother, in tow. And the oldest of the children, Bertha, who was born in 1887, and the youngest, Edwin, also made separate trips to Tacoma. So it seems that all members of the family traveled separately and ended up living in separate houses, but all made the same journey to Tacoma. My assumption, and it's an educated guess from family stories, is that when Minnie came out as the first person to make that move, she found it to be a great environment and sent stories back home to Wisconsin that, yes, you should follow me here. This is a great place to be. So Dora rented a house on Hilltop and worked in furniture factories as a seamstress while Edna went to school. Until the day she died in the year 2000 at the age of 90, my grandmother Edna remained resentful of the fact that she had to drop out of school in the 11th grade and never went back to finish high school. She was asked to help make money to support the household, and she went to work alongside her older sister in furniture factories. This is confirmed by the 1927 city directory, when she would have been 16 years old, and she was working with Dora at the Washington Parlor Furniture Company, and her job was to stitch furniture upholstery. The same strong, well-coordinated hands that she used in that work, though, would help propel her into a whole new pursuit in her life, which would really transform her life and that of her descendants. While working at that factory, Edna began taking piano lessons from a teacher on Pacific Avenue, and her talent became very quickly clear. By 1933, she shows up in the city directory listed as a music teacher. So ever since I was a little girl, listening to Edna talk about her family and growing up here in Tacoma, I've wanted to know more about what happened to her father. The memories she shared with me were tinged with both sadness and anger, which is understandable. She was 5 years old when her mother died, and then her father disappears. But it also means her knowledge of details was very sketchy. There was a vague story about James coming to be with his family at the end of his life in Tacoma, but I struggled for years to confirm that story. That is until a few weeks ago. So I was searching Tacoma's historic newspapers for something else, and I stumbled on his death notice in the Tacoma paper. It stated that he had moved here to be with his family and that he had passed away and that he was going to have a funeral and be buried here in Tacoma. Now, why was I not able to find this sooner? Well, it turns out he did go back to his Danish name once again, and it was spelled differently than I had ever been told. So I had never stumbled on this in my research before. I was able to track down his gravestone at the Old Tacoma Cemetery and just visited it for the first time last week. So I share this not just as a glimpse into a story about my family history, but it's also an example of a trend that runs through all the stories I'm sharing today. In all of these families, there was an example of an older relative brought to Tacoma at the end of their life to live out their last days here and be buried here. And I think that says a lot about how much each of these families cared about their new home of Tacoma, that it wasn't just a place they were temporarily staying. It was a place that they had determinedly moved to and wanted to make roots here by bringing an older relative out to end their lives here. There are examples throughout my family tree of people born long before Tacoma was even incorporated as a city, and certainly before the railroad came here, who are nonetheless buried here. So we've met now 3 of the 4 families whose paths would cross in Tacoma to become my ancestors. I've saved for last the family about which I have the most direct account of the rail journey here. So I'll be sharing this story with the help of my grandmother Maureen's memoir. My grandmother is pictured here as the tiny young little girl out in the right picture. It's a little bit of a fuzzy picture, but she is walking home from school in that photograph as a very young girl. So I'm going to begin by quoting from her memoir. "We lived in a small, shabby gray house at the rear of a large flat lot. The house was placed there almost on the alley because it was built as the dwelling for the owner of the little grocery store at the front of the lot. A long path stretched from the sidewalk back to the house. It also had been a long, long path which led us from our home in South Dakota to that little gray Tacoma house. Our father died in his 40s, leaving his wife and 5 children. We were 4 boys and 1 girl, me in the middle. Our mother was a gentle, insecure woman whose total attention had been given to motherhood and housewifery. She was bereft after Papa's death. The person in her life on whom she had depended, besides our father, was her oldest brother, John. So it was natural for her to decide to move us all to the city where he lived, Tacoma. In addition to working for the Northern Pacific Railway, he and his wife Dora ran a little mom and pop store and lived in a house at the rear of the store." So pictured here, the center 2 photos at left is Maureen's mother, Lucille Ragna Johnson, and at right is the older brother that was described there. So Lucille was born in Minnesota in 1882 to Norwegian immigrants. And her father, Lewis Henderson, was a lawyer who had followed several of his sisters from Minnesota to South Dakota to claim homestead lands. Because he was a lawyer, he was in a position to take a job with the government, and he chose to work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This meant that my grandmother lived in a small house on the Sioux Indian Reservation when she was a young girl. So returning to her memoir, "A change in life makes everything stand still. Places, faces, events are caught as by a camera and recalled with abnormal clarity. If there had not been the big move to Tacoma, Washington from Yankton, South Dakota, I would have remembered very little about being 12 years old. As it is, that year looms as one of the most important of my life. Only 2 months after Papa's death, we were on the train going west. That was high adventure no matter what the cause. Mama, accustomed to depending on the judgment and leadership of a man, gathered us about her and fled as quickly as possible to her older brother John in Tacoma. My oldest brother Willis was 20. The youngest, Dickie, was not yet 2 years old. We slept in the Pullman berths at night, tucked between the slippery sheets as the train rumbled through the prairies. We lifted the tightly drawn shades to peek at the forlorn lights of towns with one main street, a grain elevator, and a tiny depot. What would Tacoma be like? Our teacher said it rained all the time there. So that year was 1927, and she goes on to describe what it was like for the family to learn the grocery business, and then how that business dried up during the Depression. Initially frightened of the huge school she would be attending in Tacoma, which was Mason, as it compared to her tiny one-room schoolhouse back in South Dakota, she went on to be a very happy student. She graduated from Stadium in 1933 and went on to the College of Puget Sound. So, the Tuttles, the Davenports, the Robertsons, and the Hendersons had now all arrived in the city of Tacoma, the city of destiny, by the late 1920s. Each of these families was pursuing dreams to try to make lives better for their descendants. And to me, looking back at this, the odds of their paths crossing seem extremely low. These are families with different trajectories, different histories, but they all happen to come together in Tacoma. And I'd like now to share the stories of how my grandparents met in Tacoma, because they are charming and right out of a Hollywood movie, honestly. The odds of these people meeting, I can just imagine that meet cute moment in a romantic comedy. So I'll start with Edna and Harmon, my paternal grandparents. So this is a picture I just took about a week ago of the 6400 block of South Montgomery in South Tacoma. So in 1930, in the latest of many moves from house to house, Edna and Harry Davenport and their children moved into the house that's pictured here, the gray colored house, 6423 South Montgomery. And they remained there until 1933. So they were there for just 3 years. In 1931, Dora and Edna Robertson moved from the hilltop, where they'd lived for quite some time, into a home at 6417 South Montgomery, 2 doors down. Both families would move within just a couple of years. So there was just a 2-year overlap of when these two families were living 2 doors down from one another. But in those years, Edna and Harmon met. She was 5 years older. She was working at the furniture factory still and trying to get her career as a music teacher started, and he was a student at Lincoln High School. By 1938, so about 5 years after they met, they would be married. Their first child, Amber, was born in 1939, and my father, Michael, was born in 1943. And although their marriage was turbulent and ended in divorce, they did have happy years. What brought them together was their mutual love of art and music. So while Edna was working as a piano teacher and performing around town, Harmon was working as a graphic artist. He hand drew newspaper advertisements for all the department stores in Tacoma and many in Seattle. This was the era of hand-drawn ads for clothing stores. And now let's move on to my maternal grandparents, Clark and Maureen. This is another very similar story of paths crossing just a few blocks away from one another. So I need to jump back to the story of HIRAM, because you haven't yet met my grandfather. He's a few generations removed from HIRAM. So after HIRAM's sudden death and the subsequent extreme financial pressure put on that family, many members of that family left Tacoma. And in fact, his oldest son, who is my direct ancestor, moved to Eastern Washington and began farming, going back to those family roots. So my grandfather, Clark, was born in Twisp. But when he was a teenager, his family moved back to the Pacific Northwest, but to Seattle. So what brought him to Tacoma? I had this conversation with my mother the other day, really trying to think this through. Well, he had a pretty tense relationship with his parents. And so it's pretty clear that after he graduated from Roosevelt High School in Seattle, he wanted to set out on his own. And he had roots and family connections in Tacoma. So he moved on his own as a young man to Tacoma. He first appears in the Tacoma City Directory in 1937 when he was 24, and he was working as a display artist for Fisher's Department Store, which was at 11th and Broadway. Maureen Henderson, meanwhile, began working that same year as a stenographer for the National Bank of Washington, about 2 blocks away. Her true dream was to be a writer and a journalist, but this was a great first job right out of college. And the story goes that they crossed paths while walking to and from work, or perhaps while going out to grab lunch in the middle of the workday. So again, these amazing coincidences of paths crossing. They were married in 1941, and after Clark's time serving in the Navy during World War II, my mother Lori was born in 1946, the first of their 4 children. All of us have countless family stories worth telling, and some are faithfully passed down from generation to generation, where others we have to uncover through some of the kind of research that I thankfully love to do. But what's really become abundantly clear to me through researching these stories is how it is more than just a coincidence that these paths crossed. Some obviously interesting coincidences took place, but what brought them all here was the railroad. Their lives and the subsequent trajectories of these families were forever changed by the fact that each of these people decided to get on that train, make their way to this new city that they had never seen before, just in hopes of making a better life. I would not be here today, and my family story would not be what it is without that decision 150 years ago this year to name Tacoma as the terminus. Thank you so much for watching, and we are here for you if you are interested in researching more about your family history. So please reach out. Thank you.
This is a Tacoma Historical Society production.